The United States Navy is losing a war it never planned to fight, not against a foreign power, but against geology, against the ocean itself. And its most important base is the battlefield. Right now, the largest naval installation on the entire planet is sinking. It is a slow, relentless, multi-billion-dollar defeat unfolding in plain sight on the coast of Virginia. The very ground beneath America's Atlantic fleet is compressing, collapsing, dropping millimeter by millimeter, year after year, while at the same time, the Atlantic Ocean is rising to meet it. It's a crisis on two fronts, one from above, one from below, a geological vise threatening to crush the heart of American naval power. We're going to break down exactly how this is happening, but first, what do you think is the bigger threat, the rising water or the sinking land? Let me know in the comments. Projections show that by 2050, parts of Naval Station Norfolk will flood up to 280 times a year from high tides alone, not from storms, from the daily rhythm of the ocean. Some models project that by the end of the century, more than half of the base, the home of 75 ships, 134 aircraft, and 80,000 personnel, could be underwater. Gone, and then we'll get into the impossible engineering projects trying to stop it. Let's begin. Oh, and one quick thing. A huge number of you who watch these documentaries aren't subscribed. If you find this kind of deep dive valuable, hitting that button is the single best way to support the channel, and it ensures you won't miss what we uncover next. It's a crisis for us if you don't. Please subscribe now. The existential threat to Naval Station Norfolk was baked into its very creation. It was a problem of convenience, of ambition, of a nation hurtling toward a global war, with no time to consider the geology beneath its feet. Before it was a fortress, it was a party. In 1907, the marshy peninsula of Sewell's Point was chosen to host the Jamestown Exposition, a grand World's Fair celebrating the 300th anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. High-ranking naval officers attended the exposition, and what they saw was not the celebration, but the geography. A deep, natural harbor, direct access to the Atlantic, a strategic choke point controlling entry to the Chesapeake Bay. They saw the perfect location for a naval base. 10 years later, in April 1917, the United States entered World War I. The theories of naval power became the urgent realities of war. The Navy needed a base, and it needed it immediately. The Secretary of the Navy approved the purchase of the initial 474 acres of the old exposition grounds. But 474 acres was not nearly enough to stage a war. The Navy needed more land than existed. So they decided to make it. In a massive, frantic campaign of dredging and filling, millions of cubic yards of mud and sand were pulled from the bottom of the adjacent Elizabeth River. They were piled onto the surrounding wetlands, marshes, and tidal flats. What was once soft, absorbent, and part of the ocean's natural boundary was systematically buried, flattened, and hardened. The base grew, sprawling across this new man-made ground. It was an engineering feat born of wartime necessity. It allowed the Navy to build the piers, barracks, and airfields it needed at a speed that would have otherwise been impossible. They were building for a war they had to win. They were not building for a climate they could not predict. The ground they created was low, flat, and composed of dredged fill. It sat barely 10 feet above mean sea level, a thin crust of artificial land separating the burgeoning might of the U.S. Navy from the quiet, persistent influence of the Atlantic Ocean. For a century, that was enough. It is not enough anymore. The foundation they laid in 1917, the very earth they created to project power across the globe, is now the source of its greatest vulnerability. It was a choice made in a different world, with different assumptions, and the consequences are only now coming due. The problem in Norfolk is not just that the water is rising, it's that the ground is falling. That is the fundamental, inescapable reality that makes this crisis so much more dangerous than anywhere else. This isn't a single threat, it is a pincer movement executed by the planet itself. First, the sinking. The land in the entire Hampton Roads region is subsiding. Part of this is a deep, ancient geological process. Thousands of years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet, a colossal glacier miles thick, press down on the northern part of the continent. The Earth's crust is not rigid, it flexes. Where the ice sheet pushed down, the land around its edges, including modern-day Virginia, bulged upward. Now, with the ice long gone, that bulge is slowly, inevitably sinking back down. This process, called glacial isostatic adjustment, is a force of planetary mechanics. It cannot be stopped. It is geology settling a debt that is thousands of years old. But that's only half the story. The other half is human. For a century, as the population of Hampton Roads exploded, residents and industry drew massive amounts of fresh water from deep underground. They tapped into the Potomac Aquifer, a huge, porous rock formation that acts like a subterranean sponge. As they pumped billions of gallons out, the water pressure inside that sponge dropped. The tiny spaces between the grains of rock and sand began to compress under the immense weight of the land above. The sponge deflated, and the ground sank. USC's scientists estimate this aquifer compaction is responsible for at least half of the total subsidence in the region. We literally drank the water that was holding up the ground. We built a civilization on land that was, in part, supported by a cushion of ancient water, and then we removed the cushion. Then comes the second jaw of the vise. While the land is sinking, the ocean is rising. Global sea levels are climbing due to the thermal expansion of warming ocean water and the melting of glaciers and ice sheets. But in Norfolk, the effect is multiplied. The Sewell's Point tide gauge, located right at the naval base, has measured a relative sea level rise of 14 to 18 inches over the last century. That's up to twice the global average. Half of that is the land sinking. The other half is the water rising. For every inch the ocean comes up, the base goes down, doubling the speed of the crisis. Rear Admiral David Titley, the former chief oceanographer of the Navy, has been warning about this for years. He doesn't mince words. He calls Norfolk a sea level hotspot, a place where the combined effects are creating a uniquely urgent national security threat. The Navy, he has stated, is running out of time to act. It's a problem that most places don't have to face. Is your city dealing with anything even close to this? Let us know below. This isn't a distant theoretical problem for the year 2100. It is a daily, operational nightmare happening right now. The flooding in Norfolk no longer requires a hurricane. It doesn't even require rain. It just requires a full moon. So-called nuisance, flooding from normal high tides happening on bright, sunny days, is now a routine occurrence. Access roads to the base become impassable. Parking lots turn into shallow lakes. The infrastructure that supports 80,000 active duty personnel is regularly compromised not by an act of war, but by the tide chart. Rear Admiral Dixon Smith, a former commander of the Navy Region Mid-Atlantic, lived in one of the historic homes on Admiral's Row at the base. He has publicly recounted how his backyard would regularly flood during high tides, forcing him to leave his house through the front door because the back was simply underwater. When the man in charge of the entire region's naval installations can't use his own back door because of routine flooding, you are no longer talking about an inconvenience. You are talking about a fundamental failure of the environment to support the mission. I was stunned at the localized flooding on the streets, Smith once said, and it wasn't even a hurricane. The projections are where the true scale of the disaster comes into focus. Under intermediate scenarios from the Department of Defense and NOAA, the relative sea level in Hampton Roads is expected to rise by another 1 to 3 feet by 2050. That number doesn't sound like much. 1 foot. 3 feet. But on a base where the average elevation is just 10 feet above sea level, it is the difference between a functioning military installation and a collection of islands. With that level of rise, the lowest lying areas of the base will experience up to 280 tidal floods per year. That's not a few days a month. That's more often than not. Look further out, to 2100, and the numbers become apocalyptic. Some respected models project a rise of between 4.5 and 6.9 feet. At that level, upwards of 60% of Naval Station Norfolk, the homeport of America's carrier strike groups, would be underwater during high tide. The most powerful naval base in the world would be, for all intents and purposes, part of the ocean. Facing a crisis measured in inches and costing billions, the Navy has been forced to wage an engineering war on two fronts, one to hold back the water and one to prop up the very Earth itself. It is one of the most complex and expensive infrastructure battles in American military history. The first front is visible, concrete, and staggeringly expensive. It's the fight for the piers. Naval Station Norfolk has 14 of them. They are the arteries of the base, the place where warships receive power, supplies, and maintenance. They are the physical link between the land and the fleet. And they were all built for a sea level that no longer exists. The old piers are too low. Their electrical systems, communication lines, and support utilities are vulnerable to the rising water. So the Navy has been forced into a radical, pier-by-pier replacement program. They are not just repairing the old structures. They are demolishing them and building new ones, engineered to stand higher, stronger, and more resilient to a future of permanent high water. The cost is astronomical. The official Navy budget for the replacement of a single pier, Submarine Pier 3, ranges from $100 million to $250 million. One pier, $250 million. Now multiply that across a base that has 14 major piers, many of them dating back decades. This isn't a line item in a defense budget. It's a generational investment just to keep the base functional. The total cost to rebuild the entire waterfront to modern flood-resilient standards will run into the multiple billions of dollars. And that's just the piers. It doesn't account for the roads, the buildings, the runways, the thousands of other pieces of infrastructure spread across the base's thousands of acres. If you think this story is important, please share this video with family and friends and hit that like button. It's the only way to get this information out there. Each new pier is a fortress. It is built higher off the water. Its utility connections are elevated and flood-proofed. The pilings are driven deeper into the dredged fill and underlying seabed. Designed to withstand not just higher water, but also increased storm surge from more powerful hurricanes. It is a slow, methodical, incredibly expensive retreat upward. For every new pier that is completed, an old one is scheduled for demolition, a constant cycle of construction just to stay ahead of the rising tide. But raising the piers only solves half the problem. What good is a high and dry pier if the land it's connected to is sinking? That's the second front of this war, the fight against subsidence. And the solution here is far more audacious, almost science fiction. The goal isn't to build over the sinking land. The goal is to stop it from sinking. An organization in the region has a plan to actually re-inflate the ground. The Hampton Roads Sanitation District, or HRESD, is pioneering a project called the Sustainable Water Initiative for Tomorrow. SWIFT. The concept is as radical as it is brilliant. They are taking millions of gallons of municipal wastewater, putting it through a state-of-the-art purification process, far beyond what's required for standard discharge, and then pumping that highly treated water back down, deep into the Potomac Aquifer. They are literally refilling the sponge. The goal is to rebuild the underground water pressure that has been lost over a century of pumping. By injecting water back into the aquifer, they aim to halt, and perhaps even slightly reverse, the land subsidence caused by its compaction. They are using the region's own wastewater to push the ground back up, to repressurize the geology and create a more stable foundation for the entire region, including the naval base. The United States Geological Survey is monitoring the project with incredible precision, using sensitive instruments called extensometers that can detect microscopic changes in the elevation of the land. And the early data is promising. Areas near the injection sites are showing signs of stabilization. The sinking is slowing down. In some localized spots, it has stopped. It is an extraordinary feat of environmental engineering, a potential solution that addresses the root cause of half the problem. But the scale is daunting. The SWIFT project currently injects millions of gallons a day, but the Potomac Aquifer is vast, stretching across multiple states, and the amount of water withdrawn over the decades is immense. Is it possible to inject enough water, fast enough, across a wide enough area to save an entire region from sinking? No one knows for sure. The Navy is spending billions to build higher piers. The sanitation district is trying to raise the very earth, and both are in a race against a clock that is being set by forces far beyond their control. This is a crisis that has been building for decades, identified by scientists and acknowledged by the military. And yet, at the moment of maximum urgency, the gears of government can grind to a halt. The political and bureaucratic response to the sinking of Naval Station Norfolk is a story of its own, a story of warnings given, programs created, and momentum lost. For over a decade, the Department of Defense has officially recognized climate change and the sea level rise it causes as a direct threat to national security. This isn't a partisan debate inside the Pentagon. It is an accepted operational reality. They produced reports, threat assessments, and adaptation strategies. In fiscal year 2023, Congress took a concrete step. The National Defense Authorization Act, the massive annual bill that funds the military, included a provision to create a new position, the Interagency Regional Coordinator for Resilience, or IRCR. The idea was to place a dedicated coordinator in key, high-risk locations to shepherd the collaboration between military bases and their surrounding civilian communities. It was an admission that a base doesn't exist in a vacuum. A flooded city can't support a functioning base. A base cut off by flooded roads is a base that can't deploy its forces. Coordination was essential. And the very first pilot location chosen for this critical new program was Norfolk. It was a clear signal from Washington that Hampton Roads was ground zero. And then, nothing happened. The position, designated as a top priority for national security resilience, sat vacant. The crucial work of coordinating the multi-billion-dollar efforts of the Navy, the City of Norfolk, the State of Virginia, and federal agencies like FEMA and NOAA was left undone by the very office created to do it. By mid-2026, the situation had become so dire that it triggered a formal political intervention. On June 15, 2026, a bipartisan coalition of Virginia's congressional lawmakers, including Representative Bobby Scott and Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, sent a formal letter to the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. The letter was not a gentle inquiry. It was a demand for action. They pointed out that the position had been authorized, funded, and highlighted as essential. They asked why it had been left to wither on the vine. Representative Scott put the stakes in blunt, unmistakable terms. If a base is underwater, he said, reflecting on the letter, obviously planes can't take off, and it's hard to operate a military base if you can't get around. The letter was a flare of frustration shot from the front lines of the crisis, aimed directly at the highest levels of the Pentagon. It exposed a dangerous disconnect. While engineers were spending billions on steel and concrete, the strategic coordination meant to tie it all together was stalled by bureaucratic paralysis. The vacancy of the IRCR position is more than just an administrative oversight. It is a symbol of a larger challenge. The science is clear. The engineering solutions, while expensive, are understood. But mobilizing the vast, overlapping machinery of local, state, and federal government to act in concert is a monumental task. The military can raise its own piers, but it can't raise the city's roads. The Navy can harden its own electrical substations, but it relies on a civilian power grid. The sailors and their families live in the surrounding communities, drive on the same flood-prone streets, and depend on the same vulnerable infrastructure. Without a central coordinator, the response becomes fragmented. The Navy works on its problems. The city works on its problems. Each is spending enormous sums of money, but they risk creating a fortress surrounded by a moat it didn't build. The base becomes a hardened island in a drowning city. This political friction, the gap between knowing what to do and actually creating the cohesive structure to do it, might be the most dangerous variable in the entire equation. The water is rising. The land is sinking. And the office meant to coordinate the defense is empty. Even if the engineering succeeds, and even if the political will finally aligns, the problem of Norfolk is not a single, uniform challenge. It is a chaotic and unequal crisis, with threats that multiply and compound in unpredictable ways. The future of the base isn't just about the average rate of sea level rise. It's about the hidden fractures in the system, the weak points that could fail long before the worst-case scenarios arrive. One of the most alarming discoveries by geologists is that the land isn't just sinking, it's sinking unevenly. Some pockets of land are collapsing much faster than others. The USCs found that a nearby area called Craney Island, along with parts of the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, is subsiding at a rate 7 to 10 times faster than the regional average. The reason is a legacy of past solutions. For decades, these areas have been used as dumping grounds for the colossal weight of dredged material pulled from shipping channels. The sheer mass of this deposited earth is compressing the soft layers of sediment beneath it, accelerating the sinking in a localized, intense way. It's a feedback loop. The work done to maintain the harbor is making the land next to it sink faster. This reveals a terrifying complexity. Planners can't just prepare for a uniform 3-foot rise in sea level. They have to account for a landscape that is tilting and buckling beneath them, with weak points that could fail catastrophically and without warning. Then there's the problem of access. A naval base is not an island. It is a logistical hub that depends on a constant flow of people, equipment, and supplies from the outside world. And the roads that connect Naval Station Norfolk to that world are among the most vulnerable pieces of infrastructure in the entire region. A study by the First Street Foundation delivered a chillingly specific forecast. By the year 2037, just over a decade from now, the primary access roads leading to the naval base are projected to be underwater for up to 50 days of the year, not from catastrophic storms, just from routine high tides. For nearly 2 months out of every year, the simple act of driving to work at the world's largest naval base will be compromised. Imagine the logistical chaos. 80,000 people trying to get on and off base. Supply trucks delayed. Mission readiness compromised. A base that you can't get to is a base that can't function. And what about the acute threats? The slow, steady rise of the tides is the chronic disease, but the system is also vulnerable to sudden, massive shocks. In 2003, Hurricane Isabel slammed into the mid-Atlantic coast. It was a powerful storm that caused extensive flooding and damage across Hampton Roads. Today, that storm is used by Department of Defense planners as a benchmark, a model for what a future storm could do, and the results are terrifying. Their analysis shows that if a storm with the same strength and trajectory as Isabel were to strike in the mid-century, with the projected higher sea levels, it would inundate between 60 to 80% of Naval Station Norfolk. The multi-billion-dollar pier replacements, the flood walls, the hardened infrastructure. It might not be enough to withstand a single well-placed storm hitting at high tide. The base is being hardened for the everyday flood, but it may remain critically vulnerable to the storm that comes once a decade. The military is fighting a war against a future that is arriving faster than its defenses can be built. They are trying to solve a problem of physics with engineering and a problem of geology with politics, and they are struggling on all fronts. The third straw in Las Vegas was built to chase a retreating lake. The engineering in Norfolk is trying to hold back an advancing ocean. I know, I'm asking again. But seriously, if you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us. Hit subscribe. It's free, and it keeps us digging into stories like this one. Thanks. It's a fundamentally different kind of fight. One is a battle of scarcity. The other is a battle against abundance. An abundance of water in a place it should not be. The tunnel is built. The piers are being raised. The science is settled, and yet the fate of Naval Station Norfolk remains profoundly uncertain. The United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, finds itself in a humbling, almost impossible position. It is spending billions of dollars to defend its most critical Atlantic asset, not from an enemy fleet, but from the planet. The equation is brutal. They are building new piers that cost $250 million each, just to stay a few feet above the rising water. They are supporting an audacious plan to inject purified wastewater into the earth, a desperate attempt to reinflate a sinking continent. They are fighting a war on two fronts that no military has ever faced before, against an opponent that cannot be deterred, sanctioned, or defeated. Geology does not negotiate. The efforts are extraordinary. The engineering is brilliant. The commitment is real. But is it enough? The models that predict a 3-foot rise by 2050 are the intermediate scenarios. The worst-case models, the ones that scientists increasingly warn, may be the more realistic ones, predict a future where no amount of pier raising or ground inflating can save the base. a future where the only viable option is retreat. Where do you move 75 ships, including nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines? Where do you relocate the headquarters for the entire U.S. Atlantic Fleet? The logistical and strategic implications of abandoning Norfolk are almost too vast to contemplate. It would be the single largest strategic realignment of American naval power in a century, forced not by a change in geopolitics, but by a change in tide gauge readings. The uncomfortable question that lingers behind every new pier and every gallon of injected water is whether this is a fight that can actually be won, or if it's just the most expensive holding action in military history. Are they securing the future of the fleet, or are they just buying a few more decades on a piece of land that is destined to return to the sea? Naval Station Norfolk is not an anomaly. It is a preview. It is the most visible, most strategically critical example of a crisis that is unfolding on every coastline in the world. Every port, every coastal city, every piece of infrastructure built on the assumption of a stable sea level is now facing the same fundamental calculus. The choices being made here, the billions being spent, the political battles being fought, the engineering gambles being taken, are a blueprint for a future that many other places will soon face. The fight for Norfolk is a fight for time. Time for the engineering to catch up. Time for the political coordination to solidify. Time for solutions like the SWIFT project to prove they can work at scale. But the clock is being set by the thermal expansion of the oceans and the slow, inevitable settling of the Earth's crust.